And what is going on in Syria? We are going to continue talking about it. Joining us to discuss Syria's political transition and rivalry between the United States and China in the Middle East is political analyst Ross Feingold. Ross, thank you so much for joining us here on A News once again. We were talking about the impacts of the Middle East in the Syrian situation, but actually roles of United States and China are quite important as well. So what role is China playing in shaping Syria's future amidst United States involvement and regional rivalry?
The interesting thing here is that historically, China didn't try to play a key diplomatic role in the Middle East. It mostly deferred to the United States and Russia on that. And China's general approach would be to work with who's ever the government in power in any of the Middle Eastern countries. But over the last few years, we've seen China taking a much more active role in diplomacy in the Middle East. One of their notable achievements was bringing Saudi Arabia and Iran back together again, resuming the diplomatic relationship, which was mediated by China. We've also more recently seen China try to mediate a unity agreement with different factions among the Palestinians. So clearly China has changed. It definitely has a willingness and a desire to be more of a player when it comes to diplomacy in the region. Now, certainly China has things to offer the current transitional government in Syria, most notably would be aid. Syria needs reconstruction aid. It's going to cost a lot of money, and that's something China could offer state-owned companies and could offer money to come in and start with the rebuilding process. So chances are that China is going to be willing to play a significant role in Syria as the Syrian people determine what their political future is.
So about the U.S. and Chinese policies in Syria, how do you think that they're going to reflect their broader geopolitical rivalry in the region?
The interesting thing with that is President Trump is taking over on January 20th. And we know that President Trump, people like to describe his foreign policy approach as being transactional. So to contrast that with the outgoing Biden administration, if Kamala Harris had won or there were more years left for the Biden administration, they would probably be talking a lot about democracy and human rights and things like that. I don't think we're going to hear a lot about that from the Trump administration. We might hear about the importance of protecting minorities, and specifically the Christian minority in Syria. Now, the contrast with China is that China is not going to come in and give Syria a lecture about human rights and democracy. China, as I said, they're going to look to work with whoever is the government at the moment. And we have a new government, a transitional government in Syria, and China's just going to look to work directly with them without the lecture about things such as human rights and democracy. And maybe that won't come from the Trump administration either. It remains to be seen. Trump himself, again, he's not going to be so focused on things like that, but his team might be a little bit more focused on democracy and human rights as a condition for closer cooperation with the United States. And of course, there's the more immediate barrier, which is that HTS is still listed as a terrorist organization by the United States. So it's either going to be up to the Biden administration in the next few weeks to remove that designation, or it would fall on the Trump administration to remove that designation before the United States could engage. And China simply doesn't have that issue because they don't treat HTS as a terrorist organization.
And about the impact of China's growing influence and U.S. presidents have on Syria's political stability and reconstruction efforts, what would you say about that?
I think that both the United States and China are going to look to be a significant influencing factor as Syria goes forward, especially because Russia is probably not going to be a significant factor. We know that Russia helped support Bashar al-Assad's government. They have naval and Air Force bases in Syria, but their main focus right now, Russia's main focus, is on the war with Ukraine. So it makes it more likely that China is going to fill the vacuum that Russia is leaving behind. And the United States, the really interesting thing is that all recent presidents, whether it was President Bush, President Obama, President Trump, President Biden, they all say that the United States is going to shift its focus to the Asia-Pacific region. But then they all get stuck having to deal with a lot of issues in the Middle East. It's become unavoidable for all the recent US presidents. So even if Trump wants to focus more on Asia Pacific, he's also going to have to focus on the Middle East and Syria, keeping in mind that there's approximately 1,000 US troops still in Syria at the moment. And just as happened in the first Trump administration, even if Trump wants to remove those US troops, he's going to get a lot of pushback from his national security team, who are going to emphasize the importance of keeping a smaller number of US troops in Syria to fight ISIS and to support the Kurds.
And what are the potential implications of US-Chinese competition for Syria's sovereignty and reconstruction process?
The approaches of the United States and China are going to be quite different. The United States might mention democracy and human rights. U.S. companies, if they're going to be involved in reconstruction, they're going to expect to be part of transparent and competitive bidding processes. And China is not going to look at those issues as to be the method by which China would participate in the rebuilding of Syria. China is going to come in and say, we could give you X dollars of money. We want our state-owned companies to be involved in rebuilding the infrastructure. And it's just a less strings attached kind of approach than you would typically get from the United States government or from American companies. So if Syria's government wants the no strings attached approach, they could try China. If they want to build a relationship with the United States for other reasons, then they'll have to deal with all the attachments that come with dealing with the United States government or with American companies.
And you were actually pointing out about the approach of China and the United States being so different. And we know that China was not really involved in the war when war was happening. So do you think that the transition government and the government right now in Syria is going to be willing to talk with China because they were never really involved in this situation?
I think they will. Again, Russia is leaving. It's not going to have influence with the new government because it was working as a partner with al-Assad's government. So Russia's brand image is certainly damaged in Syria. And China is going to come in and say, yeah, we could help you. We could work with you. And we're not going to attach a lot of conditions. So even if China was not working with the new government when they were simply a rebel force, I don't think that's an impediment for the new government to work with China. Frankly, I think they'd be quite eager to work with China.
And lastly, what would you say about the presence of other countries in the Middle East that they were involved in for a while? I know that the United States was involved in the Syrian situation for a while, but they were also quite far away, geopolitically speaking. And surrounding Syria, there are Türkiye, there are also Iran was involved in it, and they were supporting Assad, and Russia was involved in it. So they are a part of the Middle Eastern process, one may call them. So what would you say about their presence and when there is a push and pull between China and the United States, and we have so many actors inside as well? What would you say about it?
The good thing for China, from their perspective, is that they generally have good relations with the other countries that might be involved in Syria's rebuilding process or the formation of a new governance structure going forward, if they revise the constitution, if they eventually hold elections. China has good relationship with Turkey. China has good relationship with the other Middle East countries that might provide significant funding for Syria reconstruction, whether that's Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates. China has very positive relationships with all these countries at the moment. The United States has positive relationships with them too, but the relationship between China and these countries, it's mostly about doing business. It's about making money, and it's not about talking about things like human rights or democracy or those types of good governance issues. So I think China would find some other partners as well that it might be able to work with. You know, again, some of these other countries might provide funding, but Chinese state-owned companies could come in and do the actual work, or they could work in partnership with companies from the Persian Gulf. So from China's perspective, I think they have a lot of upside potential when it comes to working with other countries in Syria, and that might not be the advantage that the United States has. Because the United States would probably, again, they would attach conditions, and they would be hoping that American companies could get some of the relevant contracts.
Ross, thank you so much for your analysis and joining us, sparing your time here on A News.
Thank you.
Now let's continue.